Welcome to Industry Focus, the podcast that dives into a different sector of the stock market every day. Today is Thursday, September 26th, and we're talking about energy markets and the legacy of Boone Pickens. I'm your host, Nick Sciple, and today I'm joined by Motley Fool contributor Jason Hall via Skype. How's it going, Jason?
It's very, very good. In addition to my usual stuff for the Fool, I've spent the past couple months helping out with Million Acres. I know you've heard of, and probably some of the other regular listeners to some of the other industry focused podcasts have probably heard about it too. I've been working on reviewing all of these crowdfunding real estate websites, and there's a ton of them out there. And it's been a lot of fun, kind of adding something a little bit different to my workflow.
Yeah, real estate's an interesting market to invest in. A lot of interesting opportunities out there. You talked about the crowdfunding stuff. That's something that really has only opened up in the past couple years with the Jobs Act and that sort of thing. So really an interesting space for investors to get exposed to if they're interested in it. What we're going to talk about today, though, is the oil markets. That's where you spend most of your time with the Fool paying attention to. And we're going to talk about Boone Pickens, as I'm sure a lot of our listeners are familiar with. A little over 2 weeks ago, Boone Pickens, billionaire energy executive, entrepreneur, also avid college football fan like Jason and I, passed away on September 11th. Jason, before he passed, I think a few years ago, you had the chance to go out and meet him. What kind of was that experience like, and what can you tell for our listeners about Boone as a person and his contributions to the industry?
Yeah, interesting story. Some of you may have read some of the things I've written about Pickens in the past, but I got the opportunity to meet Pickens basically by making him mad. I wrote an article, I think it was late 2013 or 2014, and the headline of the article, to paraphrase, was "Boone Pickens is dangerous for American energy companies." Pickens was a voracious consumer of news, and particularly anything that had his name in it. He wanted to see what was being said, why it was being said, and super media savvy guy. I got a private message from him on Twitter. It was a little surprising, a little intimidating. I expected the guy was going to tear me apart. Like a day later, we had a phone conversation, and he was one of the most gregarious, just easy to talk to people you could ever meet. And that led to a face-to-face meeting. I flew to Dallas and spent a day in his hedge fund, met him for breakfast beforehand, and really just a really interesting character. And ended up going out to his ranch with a couple of editors from the Motley Fool, and we did a long form, like an hour video interview conversation with him. And it was really interesting to get the insight of seeing someone that successful for that long, kind of get a feel for what makes them tick. It was a lot of fun. It really was.
Yeah, and he's a guy, just to give a little bit of his bio, has really kind of come from very humble origins. Born in 1928 in Holdenville, Oklahoma, grew up in Amarillo, Texas. He's got a great story where they talked about, after his first year of college, he came home to his parents, and they said, he wasn't doing that well in school, and they said, "Hey, a fool with a plan can outsmart a genius without one every time. Your mother and I are afraid our son is the fool without a plan." That's not what you think of a guy who goes on to become a billionaire, but then he went on to what became Oklahoma State University, got a degree in geology, went out to the oil fields as a roughneck, worked in refineries, did that sort of thing. And then in 1957, founded Mesa Petroleum, which would grow to become one of the largest, most important independent oil and gas businesses. Started out like a lot of oil guys do, selling prospects, a wildcat driller, and then grew on from there. But where his fame really began to grow was starting in the late 1960s and moving over the next couple decades through acquisitions and hostile takeovers. Can you talk a little bit, Jason, about kind of his approach to those and kind of how he became famous as a little bit of a corporate raider?
Yeah, I think this is probably his most important legacy that almost nobody really knows about anymore, especially younger generations, because this is 40 years ago that he 35, 40 years ago that he really started establishing this legacy. One of the things that he found that he really had issue with was that at the time, management and these other independent oil companies, they essentially acted like they owned the company, even though most of them had very little, if any, actual stake in shares in the company. He tells a famous story about a conversation he had with it was a board member who was a large shareholder of one of these companies. When Pickens approached him about establishing a dividend. And essentially the guy's response was, why in the blank would we want to give a bunch of money to people we don't even know? Mm-hmm. And that was, I think that was just kind of the general underlying idea back then from boards, and then within management, they had substantial salaries and cash benefits, but they had very little stake to the company itself. And Pickens was he was an early leader. I think he founded, was it the United Shareholder Association? I think, is that what it's called? That essentially pushed for more accountability and also pushed for managements to have more aligned interests, including ownership of stock of the companies that they were running on behalf of the actual owners, you and me, the shareholders, versus pretending they were owners of companies that the assets were owned by others. So that was a big thing that he was involved in, and part of it because was his he was kind of like the early activist investor, right? He was a corporate raider, is what he was generally called, because he led some pretty serious buyouts of companies that were much larger than his Mesa was at the time, and he was pretty successful in doing that. There's a flip side. There's the other side of that coin is that he was also accused of at times kind of front running a little bit, mm-hmm. where he or his associates would take a stake in a company, and then they'd let rumors float out that Pickens was gonna come in and he's gonna swoop in and buy him out, and share price would shoot up, and they'd just sell and take the profit, even though there was never really any serious intent to buy the company. So those are allegations. There was never any he was never taken to trial or anything like that for doing anything illegal, but there was a lot of rumor that he used that as just a way to make a quick buck on his reputation.
Right, and that's one of those that just goes to even have that opportunity, you have to have a strong reputation of creating that value, and that's something that he had a strong history of over time, built a reputation. I mean, today, activist shareholding is something that's come to be expected. We see these stakes taken all the time, and we see management be, even with small stakes today, very responsive to activist pressure. Whereas in the past, I read one story about Pickens was taking an activist stake in a Japanese firm, owned 26% of the stock, and couldn't get them to put him on the board. How quickly things have changed over the past couple decades. Just the responsiveness to shareholder pressure.
You hear names like Carl Icahn. Mm-hmm. These are household names for investors today. Very well-known, popular, considered activist investors. There's dozens of them now.
Yep. And then so he stuck with Mesa for most of his career. Then in 1996, he was forced out of the company, formed his own independent investment firm, BP Capital, Boone Pickens Capital, which became one of the most successful hedge funds focused on oil and gas, commodities, and energy-dependent equities. He described this transition as halftime in his life, and he also in that time moved to make some significant investments in American energy independence, natural gas, and wind energy, which we'll talk a little bit about on the back half of the show. And in 2006, formed the T. Boone Pickens Foundation, where he donated billions of dollars to charity. So as Jason and I had mentioned, T. Boone Pickens had a significant reputation as a corporate raider and as moving into acquisitions. But later in his life, he really started to ramp up his philanthropic impact. In 2010, when Warren Buffett and Bill Gates went public with their giving pledge, T. Boone Pickens had already signed on to that, and before he'd passed away, had given away most of his, a significant portion of his wealth, had several record-setting donations. He gave a $165 million gift to Oklahoma State University, his alma mater, in 2005, which is the single largest gift for athletics in NCAA history. Also has the largest donation to the American Red Cross in the history of that organization. When you look at philanthropic legacy of T. Boone, what kind of stands out to you, Jason?
So I think the obvious one that people see is, Oklahoma State University's football stadium is called Boone Pickens Stadium. So people immediately say, okay, this is just a big booster who threw a ton of money at their football program. And it's true, he did, but that's not all he did. About half the money he gave, and I think he gave like close to $700 million to Oklahoma State. More than half of that went to academic causes. So that's huge. I mean, this is someone who had a college education that he directly benefited from. He understood the value of that. A lot of the money that he has given pays for scholarships for underprivileged kids to be able to afford to go to college. So again, this is somebody who came from humble roots. He gets the idea of a leg up versus a handout. So I think he kind of lived that in the way that he gave his money in those causes. One of my other kind of favorite things that I admire about Pickens is that tons of very wealthy people have signed the giving pledge and haven't given a single dime, and they say that when they die they will. Pickens had given away probably more than twice what his net worth was when he died. He gave away a tremendous amount of money while he was alive, and he made it clear he's if I'm dead, I'm not really going to be able to see what my money did. And he enjoyed seeing people benefit from the gifts that he gave. One of his kind of famous Boonerisms was his two favorite things were to make money and give it away. And he lived that. He really did. So, I think that's something very, very admirable.
Yeah, particularly, when you look at someone who achieved that level of wealth, the philanthropic gifts that come from that wealth are something that really can pay dividends to folks, on and on and on, in addition to, your lifetime, which is just really significant impact on folks. Another significant impact that Boone Pickens has had is his advocacy for wind energy in the U.S. and for U.S. energy independence. Can you talk a little bit about kind of the efforts that he made there to advance those causes?
Yeah, I think history is going to always look back on Pickens as the wildcatter, the oil baron, and that's fair. That's where he made the vast majority of his wealth. That's what he spent the vast majority of the 6 decades he was in the energy industry involved in. But when we got into the 2006, 2007 time period, there was a lot of talk of peak oil. At that point we hadn't really developed the technologies to really access shale cost effectively, and imported oil was steadily becoming a bigger and bigger portion of U.S. energy needs. Pickens founded, so they kicked off something called the Pickens Plan. I think it was in 2008. And its main goal was for the United States to be truly energy independent, and mainly to free it from its heavy dependence on oil from OPEC, led by Saudi Arabia. He never considered Saudi Arabia to really be a true ally for the United States. Essentially, we got the oil and they got our military defense, and billions and billions and billions of U.S. dollars that were paid to export or to import that oil into the U.S. So he saw the value in the Midwestern corridor of the United States in terms of wind. It's been commonly called the Saudi Arabia of wind. We have enormous, very productive wind resources in the Midwestern United States. The irony here is, Pickens, as was typical for him, he didn't just talk it; he backed it, and he would tell anybody that would listen to him that he lost his what on his bets on wind energy. And he says he lost about $200 million, which is a substantial amount of money. But then he would just as quickly tell you he wasn't wrong. He was just early. And if you look at the what's happened in wind energy, not just in the U.S. but around the world, look in Japan and Europe and other places, wind energy has been, over the past decade, the fastest growing source of alternative energy, taking share primarily away from coal. which is fantastic. I mean, it's wonderful. It's cleaner. It's domestically produced. It's the jobs in that industry are technically skilled jobs that pay a lot of money. So there's a lot of things to like about it. Pickens he didn't make any money in it, but he was a huge advocate for it. Over the past probably 6 or 7 years, you saw his advocacy evolve a little bit to also include natural gas. And something he had been involved in for a long time, and in particular as a transportation fuel. One of the byproducts of shale fracking is a tremendous amount of natural gas reserves that we've been able to access in the U.S. You know, a decade ago, there was real concern that we would have to start importing natural gas at very, very high expense, but that's no longer even remotely on the radar. But natural gas, the idea for transportation is it's substantially cleaner than gasoline and diesel in terms of the carbon emissions. It doesn't have the particulates that cause acid rain, that cause respiratory problems, especially in urban areas. So there's a lot to like about it. A company he founded in the late 90s, Clean Energy Fuels, has kind of emerged over the past few years as a really viable leader in alternative fuels, not just with traditional, drilling a hole and pulling methane out of the ground, but also biomethane, which it sells as a brand called Redeem. And biomethane, it comes from landfills, comes from cattle farming, dairy farming. Essentially, they're capturing this methane that's a really, really powerful greenhouse gas if we just let it come out of these sites as it would. By using it as a transportation fuel, I think it reduces the environmental impact like 70 or 80% versus using diesel in those same vehicles, and it's cheaper too. So this is another part of his legacy that he was an early advocate for. I think it'll probably go under the radar because he's such a dominant figure in the U.S. oil and gas industry that his advocacy for renewable, cleaner, domestic things, I don't think it's going to have as big of a public legacy, but I think behind his shareholder advocacy, this could be by far the most important thing that he put his money and his energy into when we look back in 10 or 20 years.
Yeah, I think on both of these trends, it seems to be that he was kind of, I don't know if he's, like he said, he's not wrong. He's kind of early to the progression towards these types of fuels. And as we've seen natural gas become a more and more important part of our energy mix, I think that's only going to continue going forward. Other area where Mesa seemed to be kind of on the forefront, their fitness program became kind of a model for corporate America. T. Boone was a little kind of famous for his active lifestyle. I think you had a note about when you had met him, you even saw him engaging in some of that. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, he up into his late 80s, he had daily activity. Fortunate because of his wealth, he was able to afford a personal trainer that went wherever he was. And I saw him with my own eyes, 86, 87 years old, wearing a 40-pound weighted vest, doing squats and lunges for 20 minutes. Doing his reps, and then drop the vest and hop on the treadmill for a half an hour. It was a little intimidating. It's like, okay, I get the point, Boone. I need to step up my game a little bit. But he was active his entire life. He was a short man. He was only maybe 5'8" or 5'9" when I met him. I'm sure he was a little bit taller when he was younger. But he played basketball. He had a small basketball scholarship as part of to help pay for part of his college. So this was somebody who was athletic and who stayed physically active his entire life. I have no doubt that that played a big role on him being able to live the active lifestyle. And when I met him, he was still flying in his private jet. He would fly. Every week he would go somewhere for a speech, or if Clean Energy was opening a fueling station, he would always go there for the ribbon cutting of the fueling station. He was incredibly, incredibly physically active. And that's why he was able to be so active for so long into his life. So I think that's a model that is a reminder that, wealth is great and investing for a profit is fantastic. But if you don't take care of your physical form, it's kind of hard to enjoy it.
Yeah, he had some line where he said, I want to feel good for my entire life, and I'm going to do the things that I need to do that. I think one of my favorite stories that I read about when I was preparing for this podcast talked about his favorite golf story. The last round of golf he ever played, April 18th, 2007. He was a member of Augusta National, played there about 100 times during his career. But in that particular golf game, he eagled number 11 at Augusta. Went and told Arnold Palmer about that, asked him if he'd ever eagled number 11 on Augusta. He said he hadn't, and then he called it a day for his golfing career after that one. Said, hey, we're never going to get up, never going to do any better than that going forward, which is so relatable to me as someone who really struggles at golf, and just whenever I get a good shot, I just want to cherish that in me. That's something that is so relatable to me. Last thing before we move on to a different topic, when you think about T. Boone Pickens and kind of the impact he had on investing and oil markets. For folks who aren't familiar with him, what do you think will be, one lesson from his life that you will, take moving forward that you will incorporate into kind of what you do?
So it's kind of threefold for me. His famous quote, a fool with a plan can beat a genius without a plan any day. It's so true. If you're just kind of casting about without a real plan or strategy, your success is going to be entirely based on luck. And if you have a real plan that you stick to, and that you evolve that plan as the reality dictates you need to, your chances of being successful are going to be far, far greater. They really, really are. And his tenacity, this is a man that he was so successful at Mesa for what he did. And then he got forced out of his own company. And he started all over, and he made billions after that. So this is someone who knew what failure looked like and still put his plan together, worked his plan, and made it a success. So I think that's his legacy for me, and something that anybody of any walk of life can use as a model to be more successful.
So just one other thing I wanted to ask you about is, we talked a little bit about some of the controversy surrounding Pickens, from the corporate raider reputation and being an activist investor, allegations of front running, those sorts of things. There's also been some controversy around him when it came to some of his political positions and those sorts of things. How should we think about that when we look at T. Boone's model, as someone to look to as an example, and how do you think about that, just looking at his legacy?
So, there's a few things here. And number one, it's a reminder that we're all human, right? We're whole people, and Pickens was certainly no exception to that. It was incredibly controversial, very conservative, and he was involved in some things that frankly, I think are kind of black marks. He was very heavily involved in the Swift Voters for Truth, which essentially were some slurs against John Kerry's during his presidential campaign against his military record, which essentially came out as being the unfounded stories. And Pickens, he kind of went to his grave never really owning up to being wrong on that. He backed President Donald Trump, which some people, certainly don't. Again, another very controversial person. So that's a very binary reaction to that, depending on, your support for President Trump. So I think the big point is that it's really easy when we start reading about people, learning about people, to, especially in today's highly politicized environment, to find that somebody believed a certain political thing and consider just dismissing everything else about them, right? And paint them into either the good or evil camp. And I think that's a big mistake to do that with somebody like Pickens, who was so incredibly successful, because there are always things that you can learn from someone else's success and from their failures to try to apply to your own life to do better, right? And whatever it may be. And I think for me, I vehemently disagree with Pickens on a lot of his political positions. So I think the takeaway there is that despite those things, he's someone that I still had tremendous respect for. He had a profound impact on me as an investor and as someone who understands and analyzes the energy industry. And that's far more important to me than any disagreements I had over him from a political perspective.
Right, and if you ever find someone you could agree with completely, it's hard to learn from someone like that either.
you're probably falling into a trap, right? I think as an investor, one of the first things I do when I fall in love with a company is I immediately find everything I can from people that disagree, right? Yep. Because you'll always be able to find a reason why you're going to be right. When you start looking for the reasons that you could be wrong, that's when you start learning and you start avoiding making big mistakes that you could have maybe avoided.
Yeah, so that's of particular value, I think, for folks and for anybody, with a success like Pickens has had, who has come from humble backgrounds to extreme success. There are lessons to be learned, for everyone. And, you're not going to agree on 100% of things with anybody, but we can learn from just about anyone. One other story I'd be remiss if we didn't spend a minute or two talking about is the recent attacks on Saudi Arabia's oil infrastructure and what it means for investors. When the story first came out, we had expected to see 5% of global production be offline for an indeterminate period of time. But then very quickly thereafter, we heard from Saudi Arabia's oil ministers that, it's not going to be as significant of an impact as expected. So just so far from the news we've seen available, what's been your reaction? How should folks be thinking about this Saudi Arabia attack?
Yeah, so you go back a week and a half ago, it'll be 2 weeks ago, I guess, this weekend. This was gigantic, right? And the potential implications were huge. I think something like 5% of the world's oil supplies were paused. Somebody just pressed the pause button on this massive supply of oil when Saudi Aramco had to shut down this facility and a major oil, like this, the largest oil processing facility in the world, and had to shut down one of their major oil production facilities. Oil shot up like 15% that Monday after the attack. I think it's like one of the biggest single day oil price spikes ever. And I mean, let's give some context. Oil going up 15% in one day, that's like the entire stock market going up 30% in one day. It's giant. It's huge. It's just a giant number. But I kept tempering my, like, where I was looking at it with, sure, there's this risk that it's going to be a protracted outage of a massive portion of global supplies. And the other part of it too is that you can't just take, oil from, light sweet oil from Texas and stick it in a refinery that's been running sour crude from a Saudi oil field, because the different formulations, the chemical compositions of the oil affects the refinery. So those are implications that were kind of deeper that the market was looking at. But at any rate, the thing that I kept tempering my like concerns about this is Saudi Arabia's entire economy runs on oil. Yeah, they've made investments to grow other parts of it, but oil pays the bills. And you can't expect that Saudi Arabia wouldn't throw every resource it had at getting production back online, getting the oil flowing back through that facility. And essentially that's what's happened, right? I mean, two weeks removed, and that facility is very close to being back at producing the same level of oil that it was handling before the attacks. There's still work to do, but as a result, oil prices have fallen about 7% from the peak that Monday after the attacks. They're still up about 4 to 6%, but today, as of this recording, they're down again about 1%. And West Texas crude has fallen far more than Brent crude, which, I mean, that's what the market realizes, is that this wasn't necessarily this big boon, pardon the pun there, but this wasn't a big gain for shale producers to all of a sudden cash in and sell a whole bunch more oil at 15% higher prices. So it's a reminder that, if you want to invest in any oil or gas company, you need to understand the fundamentals of that business. What's their cash even break point? How much are they having to spend in capital to grow or maintain their production, because that's cash flows that they can't return to you as dividends. So it's just a reminder that, don't buy on the uncertainty of something that you don't have the information to really make an informed long-term decision on.
Yeah, an interesting context coming out of that, those attacks is that, folks were saying, hey, shale's going to ramp up. But listen, there's already takeaway constraints. We're already taking away as much as we can away from the Permian and these places. So even if you wanted to bring shale online, there's just not enough takeaway capacity to really bring it to market.
That's true. It's going to be 6 months before there's really much additional capacity for there's already wells that are ready to produce that they can't bring online because there's, like you said, there's no takeaway capacity.
Yeah. Did it surprise you kind of the relative ease with which this attack took place? Does that merit kind of us pricing in a little bit more risk for these sorts of things moving forward?
Honestly, I can't consider myself enough of an expert on military tactics or that sort of thing to really give an informed opinion about it. It is a little surprising that something like this it's a little surprising, but it's not stunning because Iran and Saudi Arabia are mortal enemies. And so that, from that perspective, it's not surprising. But it's also not surprising that the Saudis were able to get production back up as quickly as they did because it's so important. I don't think you can overstate how important to that country it is to get that production back online.
Yes, in particular, one last thing we'll mention on this is Saudi Arabia has been preparing to IPO its Aramco state-owned oil company. There had been some rumors that it's going to be delayed, but they're going to be pushing forward with that, in the context of this recent supply disruption and what it means, this IPO means for the country. Any kind of high-level thoughts on that Aramco IPO and what we should be paying attention to there?
Yeah. First thing, I think they're still seeking a $2 trillion valuation. And, there's lots of camps, that's crazy. And if you ask any executive of any oil company in the world, would you spend $2 trillion to buy access to all the oil in Saudi Arabia? They would say yes before you even finished asking the question. Of course, it's worth that. But then you start attaching hooks to it. 90% of it's still going to be owned. It's a state-controlled company, right? And the reality is that I think investors need to understand that your interest as a shareholder will never be aligned with the majority shareholder, and that creates risk. I think there could be a nice potential for a modest income stock, depending on how they structure it. I think dividends is probably the only thing that would make it worthwhile. But there's nothing about it that to me looks like it should be attractive for retail investors. I just think there's very limited upside, and I think the downside risks are too great to make it a worthwhile investment. I think it's that full stop. I think it's that simple.
Yeah, it's one of those where political risk is so significant with a company like this. But from the perspective of Saudi Arabia, it gives them access to $100 billion plus in capital that they can invest in modernizing their economy, which has been something they have touted as something they really want to do going forward. So it makes sense from the perspective of the country, but as an investor, I don't think it's something I'd be interested in owning shares of. Any last thoughts on kind of what investors should be paying attention to in the broader oil market before we kind of close out the show?
Yeah, I think the past few weeks are just another reminder that it's very volatile. There are so many different triggers that can affect it, and if you want to make money investing in oil and gas, I think you have to go back to looking at your vertically integrated super majors, Shell, Royal Dutch Shell, I think's one that I still like because it has levers that oil prices fall and that can affect its production business. It can be good for its refining operations. I think there's still some great midstream companies out there. One Oak stock ticker OKE that I still like. Kinder Morgan continues to look better and better, but they have these predictable cash flows from these long-term takeaway contracts. These toll booth businesses, as they describe them. But for me, I think it's a reminder that it's really, really worth taking a hard look at away from oil and gas and start really considering, if you haven't, really look at alternative energy producers like Terraform Power, Brookfield Energy Partners, Pattern Energy, some of these other companies that I think that's a lot more of the future of energy, and it's a great way to start adding some diversity that's also energy without all of the crazy risks that kind of come along with oil and gas.
Yeah, and for our listeners interested in any of those companies, we've done a number of podcasts on those in the past, and I'm sure we'll have Jason on to do more of those going forward. For our listeners who follow us on Instagram, I hope you should check out our Smarter, Happier, and Richer contests on Instagram. If you head over to @TheMotleyFool official Instagram account, look out for a photo of foolish swag. You can enter by answering the question correctly and tagging a friend in the comments on the post. If you win, your friend will win too. We've got 10 Foolish caps, t-shirts, and signed Motley Fool investment guides by Tom and David Gardner as prizes. So go ahead and check that out on Instagram. Like the post and give us a comment, and maybe you'll have a chance to win. Jason, thanks as always for coming on the show, sharing some of your personal experience with the Boone Pickens and just the state of the energy markets today. Folks want to check out Million Acres and the work Jason's doing over there, please do check that out. And thanks for coming on.
I appreciate it. It's always fun to be on with you, Nick. Go dogs.
Yeah. Roll Tide, Jason. As always, people on the program may own companies discussed on the show, and the Motley Fool may have formal recommendations for or against the stocks discussed, so don't buy or sell anything based solely on what you hear. Thanks to Austin Morgan for his work behind the glass. For Jason Hall, I'm Nick Sciple. Thanks for listening, and Fool on.